In fantasy football, we nitpick an awful lot. And while sometimes it's warranted, at other times it leads us to overthink and miss out on great opportunities. And that translates to the real world as well. Because that girl that asked you out in high school, you thought about it, but you just nitpicked way too much. Her hair was a little too frizzy. She had too high of a voice, didn't wear the clothes you liked. Whatever it was, you overthought the situation and you said no. Well, that girl grew up to be an Instagram model, and instead of you getting to hang out with her on a daily basis, you're alone in your apartment with the door shut, hanging out with her in a different way. Don't become that guy. I've got two must-have running backs for you here in 2020 that a lot of you are overthinking and nitpicking. We got to stop. I'm going to convince you. Stick around, because this is why we are drafting Josh Jacobs and Joe Mixon this year. Headliner Nation, it's here. It is time. I've been telling you for weeks that this video is coming, and now you get to see it. That is right. Since we dropped our first rankings this offseason, and I told you all that I had Josh Jacobs and Joe Mixon as top 5 running backs, you all have been asking me, how, Kyle? Why could you have them so high? And this is the video to end all arguments. This will probably be one of my best, most in-depth pieces I ever do here at the Fantasy Headliners. So make sure that you sit back, relax, and you take a few minutes to listen about why we are drafting Josh Jacobs and Joe Mixon here in 2020. So first, to get started, we're going to be talking about Josh Jacobs. So let's start diving into his numbers and why he is a top 5 back for me. Josh Jacobs, we were a little bit hesitant on last season. We were a little bit worried on how he would hold up. Didn't end up doing too bad. Played in 13 games last year. His 242 attempts tied for 10th in the league. His 1,150 yards was 7th. And he also had 5 games of 100 plus yards, tied for 3rd. But it wasn't just the volume that he got. It was what he did with the volume. Josh Jacobs was a beast mode 2.0. He did so well last season when he was touching the football. His 842 yards after contact were 7th. His 3.48 yards after contact per attempt, also 7th. His 69 evaded tackles was 1st, and his .29 tackles evaded per attempt were 2nd. When Josh Jacobs was running the football last year, he was extremely difficult to bring down. And if you watch his Fantasy Headliners and you have listened to me for the last couple of years, you know how much I love those type of running backs. Now, here's the thing, and this is the reason that a lot of you are hesitant. You get worried because of Josh Jacobs in the passing game. Now, yes, they have added some guys that could potentially help in the passing game this season. But when Jake and I were at the Combine and we were standing there listening to Mike Mayock, he specifically said that we want to get Jacobs more involved on the ground and through the air. So I still expect him to see an uptick in the passing game this year. But should we have that big of concerns about his work in the passing game? Maybe we're overstating that fact a little too much. So last season in the pass game, Josh Jacobs saw 27 targets, 20 receptions, 166 yards. Absolutely nothing to write home about, correct? None of that really matters. But even though he didn't see that much in the pass game last year, there are other running backs who have succeeded as top 10 fantasy producers that didn't see much work in the passing game. So in a situation where a world that we now live in, where we want our running backs to see as many touches as possible, we tend to overlook the guys who get tons of volume. So what about another guy that was similar to that? Mark Ingram. He saw 29 targets, 26 receptions, 247 yards. He did add 5 touchdowns, which helped out immensely and made him the running back 8 in half PPR formats last year. So Mark Ingram didn't get a ton of work in the passing game, still finished as a top 10 option at running back. Well, let's spice things up a little bit more. Let's take a look at the definition of a beast at running back that does not get any work in the passing game. The man that we pushed last year so hard, Derrick Henry. Last year, Derrick Henry only saw 24 targets, 18 receptions, 206 yards and 2 touchdowns, and still finished as the running back 3 in half PPR formats. So even if Josh Jacobs doesn't end up taking that step forward and doesn't become a mass producer at the running back position through the air, he still could have a path to top 10 status as a running back because of the volume that he gets on the ground. So let's take a look at today's math lesson. You know that we love to do this here at the Fantasy Headliners and break it down a little bit more. So for today's math lesson, let's just see what Josh Jacobs could potentially do to get us towards that type of status. Well, last year, Jacobs averaged 18 attempts per game in 13 games. So for the sake of argument, we're going to say that he stays healthy for 16 games this year. And if he does at 18 attempts a game, just like last year, that gets him to 296 potential attempts in 2020. But you know what? We're going to go ahead and round up to 300. Why not? Let's make it a nice, even number. So let's say he's healthy for 16 games, gets 300 rushing attempts, because that is almost the pace that he was on for last year anyway. But his average yards per attempt, we're just going to keep it the same. We're just going to keep it the same. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more here in a couple of minutes. He averaged 4.75 yards per attempt last year, which was excellent. He's going to keep the same here in 2020, even though I think he could see an uptick in that number as well. So now that we've talked about those numbers, let's go ahead and start breaking down the math a little bit. He gets his 300 attempts times 4.75 yards per attempt. It's going to give him 1,425 yards in 2020 on the ground. Let's say his rushing touchdowns increase to 10. Yeah, he didn't score a whole lot on the ground last year, and that was probably for the fact that there weren't a whole lot of weapons at wide receiver. So even though they didn't have a ton of weapons at wide receiver, Josh Jacobs was still highly efficient on the ground, was able to produce a mass amount of yards and opportunity after getting hit, and he still didn't have that weekly ceiling in the passing game. So let's just give him a small uptick, okay? Nothing crazy. He goes from 20 to 25 receptions, okay? That's realistic, right? His receiving yards go from 166 to 200. Again, we're just being realistic here. I don't want to get too crazy and lose you. So let's say he goes from all that, just makes those slight jumps there, and really the big thing is staying healthy. So his 1,425 yards on the ground, typically you get 1 point for every 10 yards. So that gives them 142.5 points in a half PPR format. That's what we're going to be looking at, half PPR. His 200 receiving yards gives him 20 points in half PPR. His 25 receptions give him 12.5 points. We're going to bump him up to 10 rushing touchdowns. His 10 rushing touchdowns is going to give him 60 points. And then we're going to give him 2 receiving touchdowns. Again, I don't want to lose all of you and give him unrealistic expectations. I'm trying to keep things as realistic as possible so you can understand his path to being a top running back option is 100% there. If you put all of this together, you're going to get 247 half PPR fantasy points from Josh Jacobs in 2020. In 2019, if he had scored that many fantasy points, he would have been the running back 7. So, with Josh Jacobs, 247 points, gets him into running back 7 status. I've got him as my running back 5 right now. He's my running back 5. I'm only 2 spots off what he could have finished at last year if he had been healthy for 16 games. Again, the numbers I just gave you are basically just inflated a little bit to account for him being healthy for 3 extra games. If you want to fade Josh Jacobs in 2020 because you're worried about injury concerns or staying healthy for 16 games, any running back has that, don't they? I mean, if you draft Dalvin Cook, he's got those same concerns, but you've seen him in the passing game, so he's got a little bit more upside. You haven't seen it from Jacobs yet. What if you take Jacobs a couple of spots later over Dalvin Cook? Could potentially have the same upside this year if he does in fact get worked into the passing game more often. And not only that, it was really the touchdowns that killed him last year. If he would have finished with double-digit touchdowns, he would have been a lot higher up in points. But they didn't have any weapons. They had Darren Waller. That was basically it. Tyrell Williams was okay at certain times. Hunter Renfrow wasn't bad either. But now they've added Henry Ruggs. They've added Bryan Edwards. And if Tyrell Williams now in his second season is fully healthy and ready to roll, he's got a lot more weapons. Now you're looking at a team that can stretch the field way more often. So even Josh Jacobs' efficiency can go through the roof. And that is why he is still a top option for me in 2020 and why you should not be overlooking him. But enough about Josh Jacobs. Now it's time, okay? I've been telling you for a while now, we're not messing around with Joe Mixon this year. We are drafting him if he is there for us. Say it with me, Headliner Nation. That's what we're doing. And I'm going to tell you why right now. With Joe Mixon last year, now he did end up playing in 16 games. He gave you 278 attempts, 1,137 yards, which was 8th. His 278 attempts was tied for 5th. His 4 games of 100-plus yards was tied for 4th. And his 29 runs of 10-plus yards was 7th most. Now, I will tell you this. He did play 16 games, which was the first time in his career. The other two previous seasons, he only played 14 in each season. And he did, even though he played in week 1, we're going to talk about here in a minute, he did have a slight injury in week 1. And that could have led to some of his issues. But we're knocking Joe Mixon basically because of the first half of his season last year, right? Joe Mixon didn't have a great first half of the season. But you fail to overlook just how good Joe Mixon has been since entering the league in 2017. Since coming into the league, Joe Mixon has 2,931 rushing yards, 4th most during that time. His 693 attempts are 4th most during that time. He also has the 8th highest catch percentage, with at least 100 receptions among running backs, with 80.6%. So if he gets more work in the passing game, which I'm telling you people is highly likely this year, the dude can do work through the air. We just haven't had that big of an opportunity to see it. If we can get back to around the 50-ish targets that we saw from him a couple of years ago, that's good for me. Get me those 50 targets and Joe Mixon is going to do a lot with them. Can his ceiling be higher though? Well, here's some of those deep diving stats again that I gave you with Josh Jacobs. His 52 tackles avoided as a runner last year was 5th most among running backs. And his 877 yards after contact was 6th most. Now we look at his 3.18 yards after contact per attempt. And that is a little bit on the lower side, but it was only 0.5 yards less than Barkley and Elliott last season. And part of the reason for that was that offensive line, which we're going to talk about here in a second. Because if the offensive line wasn't good, Joe Mixon was getting hit quite often a little bit earlier on. And not only that, but if teams were keying on that run a little bit more and trying to stay a little bit more focused on Joe Mixon, he was having defenders swamp onto him. Okay? And one stat that is really overlooked, and nobody I have seen talk about this, he had 0 fumbles last year. He was one of only 3 running backs with at least 200 rushing attempts to do that. Joe Mixon takes care of the football. He gets the volume. He takes care of the football. We're just waiting for that ceiling to come around. Now, don't forget, the start to 2019 was a disaster. In the preseason, they had 3 injuries to their offensive line, including their first-round pick, Jonah Williams. Okay? So their offensive line was in shambles already before the season started. You lost 2 starting offensive linemen, and then your third one was a reserve. But that doesn't matter. You lose that reserve, you lose 2 starters, and now you have depleted the depth that you have built for your offensive line. On top of that, their starting left guard last year, Michael Jordan, was the youngest player on their roster. Michael Jordan did not do that bad of a job last year, and he got better as the season went on. So now this year, playing at left guard, you've got Jonah Williams at left tackle, and you've made some other signings and draft picks to potentially reinforce your offensive line. The offensive line is going to be 10 times better in 2020 than it was in 2019. And another thing that nobody talks about either, his week 1 ankle injury in the first half against Seattle. He left and he did not end up coming back after that ankle injury. And I've told people about it and they're just like, it obviously wasn't that serious enough because he played next week. But if you've listened to this channel and you've heard Dr. Ethan Turner, okay, he's our doctor here on the channel, talks about sports injuries all the time. He did a segment a couple of weeks ago with Jake, and he talked about how that ankle injury could have been one of the leading factors to starting off slow. Because there was a tremendous split in what we saw from Joe Mixon last season. Before the bye, which was week 1 through week 8, Joe Mixon averaged 12.62 attempts per game, 31.75 yards per game, and he did not score on the ground. Again, he injures his ankle in week 1. His offensive line is a pile of garbage, and they're dealing with injuries. So Joe Mixon, both of these things working against him. And Dr. Ethan Turner even said this. Sometimes it takes those ankles a while. You can tape them up, but it's just going to take some time to get back to feeling fully healthy, and it's all about pain management and load management. So they get into the bye, he gets a week off, and now all of a sudden after the bye, week 10 through week 17, we see his attempts per game boost up to 22.12 attempts per game. His yards per game go up to 102.12 yards per game, and he scores 5 touchdowns in the second half of the season. The offensive line, they get to work together a little bit more. They're working in sync now. That helps him out. He's fully healed, back from the ankle injury. It's not causing him any more pain. Now they can give him more touches. Now he can do more with the football. Now we see the true Joe Mixon from week 10 through week 17. And not only that, but they have added pieces. They have added pieces to help that offense this year. They drafted QB Joe Burrow. Love Joe Burrow. The guy's got all of the talent in the world. He should be a little bit more consistent than what we saw from Andy Dalton. They added wide receiver T. Higgins, another weapon on the outside that defenders are going to have to pay attention to. You're not going to be able to stack the box against Joe Mixon, people. It can't happen. In free agency, they added guard Xavier Suafilo. Okay, they brought him in, another guard. He can play right guard for them. That helps solidify that offensive line and make it even better. And back from injury, we already talked about it. Jonah Williams is back from injury, and AJ Green is back from injury. So all those things combined, Headliner Nation, Joe Mixon didn't have a great first half last season because he had so many things working against him. And I see so many people out there arguing about Joe Mixon not being a reliable draft pick this year because of his overall season stats and what he did in the first half of the season. Give me a break, people. Give me a break. I am tired of arguing with people about it. If I haven't been able to convince you in this video that Josh Jacobs and Joe Mixon are 100% worth your attention this year, then I can't give you any more information. But I can guarantee you this, Headliner Nation. There is not an analyst out there that has a better reason and a better argument not to draft Josh Jacobs and Joe Mixon than my argument to draft both of them. And I guarantee put a stamp on that for you. So I've given you the information. You get to do what you want to at this point. If you're willing to ride this train with me, Headliner Nation, hop on in the back. We're going to be pulling out of the station soon. There's room for you, okay? Hop on and let's ride this wild ride together here in 2020. Because Mixon and Jacobs, if they stay healthy and are on the field for 20 or 16 games, 2020 is going to be a fun year for both of them. Well, there you have it, Headliner Nation. I got fired up. I've been telling you for weeks this video is coming. I've been holding on to this information. And here over the holiday weekend, I thought it was the best time to drop it. So do me a favor, hit that like button down below and let me know in the comments, have I convinced you? And if I haven't, tell me why. Tell me why you're not convinced yet, okay? I want to know the reason. And do me a favor as well, if you're new here to the Fantasy Headliners, hit that subscribe button for me. Become a part of Headliner Nation today. Let me know in the comments so I can welcome you to this amazing community. Headliner Nation, thanks so much for tuning into this video. Absolutely loved putting it together for you. I hope you all loved it just as much as I did. I'll catch you on the next episode. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you later on the Fantasy Headliners.